Hey, good evening, and welcome everyone here to the office of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement in Copenhagen. My name is Hussein Askary. I work as the chairman of the LaRouche movement in Sweden, but I'm originally from Iraq. Been living in Europe for almost 21 years. This is a bit half of my life, and most of my grown-up life. I joined the LaRouche movement in 1993. Well, I was living in Oslo. It was the time when we had the Oslo peace agreement discussions between the Palestinians and Israelis, and that was the time I met the LaRouche movement. And I've been a member, an active member since then, because I believe that the ideas and concepts carried by this organization and Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche can have the answer to a lot of the crises we have in the world. And it's based on a deep scientific and cultural basis, which has a very, very long history for the civilization of humankind. This is, I think, the third time I speak in Copenhagen. The first time was after the crisis of the cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, which created a big crisis. So we had to come to Copenhagen and work with our friends here to make sure that this does not develop into a major crisis, and show people, what is behind, what is the strategic idea behind this attempt to insult Muslims and Islam. The second time I was in Copenhagen, it was after the invasion of Iraq, 2003. And this is the third time, and we are in the middle of very, very deep, both economic and strategic crisis. But hopefully the next time I speak in Copenhagen, we can celebrate that justice has been achieved in the world and the wrong policies of governments are reversed. Now we have now, as I said, a very deep economic and strategic crisis. I mean, there is no separation between the so-called euro crisis or the banking crisis or the financial crisis in the world, which we see every day now, collapsing markets, mass unemployment, governments not being able to manage the budget, austerity cuts. But also we have the strategic crisis, which is a confrontation between the major powers in the world, like the United States on the one hand with the British behind them, and Russia and China on the other hand. It's part of the same crisis. I mean, that strategic crisis is most obvious now in Syria, what the situation in Syria. But what is going on in Syria is not really about Syria itself, although it has a Syrian dimension as every other nation. But the real fight is in the world is about who's gonna who's gonna take charge in the world, who's gonna rule or have the policy. Is it going to be an empire, which we have now called the British Empire, the Anglo-American Empire, or is it going to be a community of sovereign, independent nation states who respect each other and work together as independent, sovereign nation states? And this is what really the fight is about. I mean, the situation in Syria, what the Russians and Chinese are trying to do with stopping the use of military force in Syria, as NATO did in Libya, the Russians are trying, and they have been saying it openly, and the Chinese, both through President Putin, but also their representatives in the UN, and also the foreign minister, Ivanov, is that what they are defending is the principle of the sovereignty of nation states. This is a red line. After what was done in Libya, where now Libya is almost a destroyed country, we also saw the regime change policy in Iraq, what it has created. Now the Russians and Chinese, that they see that this escalation, this regime change, one nation after the other, what it eventually will lead to is a major war with Russia and China. Because the whole system now we have had is what we call the financial empire, the Anglo-American financial system is collapsing now. That empire is collapsing, but the question is it going to take the rest of the world with it, or are we going to survive it? Are we going to put it into the grave and say that we can reorganize the world affairs on the basis of having a community of nations, which are independent nations, who work together for economic development, both of their own societies but also of other societies? So the whole issue, which I also want to talk about today, is this question of the sovereignty of nations, because this is the most crucial issue right now. It's also related to the sovereignty of the individual. If we lose that principle, if we allow a global empire to rule over nations, it's not only that we're going to end up having no nations, but we might end up having no civilization, because the confrontation now is that the stakes are so high that the Russians and Chinese say we are preparing ourselves for a world war. And the next world war is not going to be like First or Second World War. This is going to be a nuclear, an atomic or a thermonuclear world war. And that means that we will lose civilization. The human race might disappear from this planet. This is what the whole issue is. But some people in the United States and Britain and in Europe, they are playing a chicken game. They say, well, the Russians are bluffing. The Chinese are bluffing. Let's push a little bit more and see what they do. And this is the kind of strategic mistakes which have actually led to almost all wars, like World War I and World War II. Because you try to test the other side, but the other side is also positioning themselves to take the fight. And that's why now that the Russians are not backing up. In spite of all this propaganda going on in Russia, in Syria, they have all these massacres, we have all this killing going on, but they say we have to defend this principle of the sovereignty of nations. So the attack on Syria is an attack on the principle of national sovereignty. The attack on Europe through the Euro project was an attack on the national sovereignty of the European nations, especially Germany, at the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany, where the British and the Bush administration, the Bush senior administration, they saw that a reunified Germany, which will work in cooperation with Russia, for example, with Eastern Europe, to rebuild the economies of Europe, as a threat to the empire. And therefore they imposed this Euro system on Germany and on the rest of Europe in order to concentrate the power of over the economies of these nations somewhere else other than the sovereign institutions of the German parliament or the French parliament, and have it at a special institution which is called the EU, where decisions are supposed to be made for all nations, with the Maastricht rules, with the Nice Treaty, with now the Lisbon Treaty. So they want to more and more take the power away from the sovereign nation state and place it in the institutions which actually represent the financial and banking institutions of the empire. So the attack on Syria and the attack on Germany or the European nations through the Euro project is exactly the same thing, because it's run from this top down, from this empire. And that's what the real fight is about. Of course, I mean, we're going to discuss the solution for this crisis. There are a million ways of, for example, resolving the Syrian crisis, or through diplomatic and peaceful means. But there's an intention not to have a peaceful solution. We also have the very clear and precise solutions for the economic and financial crisis, which we have been discussing in this organization, like the GlassSteagall separation of banks from financial firms, or investment banks from commercial banks, issuing national credit for investment in the real economy of nations, and so on and so forth. So the solutions are available, but now we have to actually get at the core of what really is behind this attack, which we see now both against nations in Europe but also against other nations in the regime change policy. What I wanted to take up is beside of the, because people try to look at the news. If you try to understand what's going on in the world by watching the news or reading newspapers and make up your own idea of the world without any deep knowledge of history, actually science and everything which human society is about, I mean, just forget about it. You're not going to get anything. You may be better go fishing or doing something else, because you will not understand anything. You will be taken away by news and commentaries and psychological warfare every day. One day you go this way, the next day you go that way. You have to establish, as this movement, the LaRouche movement have been trying to do, is you have to get an idea of what is the context, what is the fight is about in a historical context, not just like who killed whom yesterday. The fight did not start yesterday. Like the situation in Syria, this goes back very long time, at least since the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when the British and the French conspired during World War II to divide the Ottoman Empire. You know, this is where the problem started in the Middle East or Southwest Asia. So what is reported in the news about the Alawites, about the Sunnis, about the Salafis, about this and that, this is just total disinformation. Even people who have good intentions in reporting, they disinform, because it does not really go to the core of the crisis. Who caused the crisis? So therefore, I mean, we encourage people to look into the history, look into the background of things. I mean, I know a journalist from an Arabic newspaper some years ago, he wrote about LaRouche, and he said, you know, you listen to LaRouche and you go on a trip for 500, 2,000 years back, you know, and you don't really understand why, you know, it's going on with that, why he goes all the way back 2,000 years ago to the Greeks, to Socrates. But then when he takes you to the last station, you understand, okay, now I get it. That's how we should look at the world. If something happens today, you have to have the background. And the background is actually about human civilization. And what ideas, great ideas, have promoted civilization, built civilization, and what ideas have destroyed civilization. What system of society have destroyed civilization. And I think this is the real core of politics. It's not, you know, being good at foreign relations and knowing, you know, have a lot of facts about things which are useful, but if you don't have a real idea about what human beings are, what our existence is about, and what is our goal in life is, a correct goal in life is, then all that knowledge would not be of use for humankind. On the way to the office today, I passed by the cemetery where Hans Christian Andersen is buried. And you know, I looked at the gravestone, and there's this inscription. You know, maybe you know it, but I tried to make an English translation as far as it says, "The soul which has been created by God in His image is indestructible and cannot be lost. Our earthly life here is the seed of eternity. Our flesh dies, but the soul is immortal." That's what makes Hans Christian Andersen a genius. It is his image of himself and of human beings which made him a genius. It's not how, of course, and his creativity, of course. But if you have knowledge, and it's like Paul says, you know, if I knew all the languages in the world and you don't have love, then as if you know nothing. But it's that idea of himself in history, that there is eternity and we are part of it. You know, we use our flesh and our creativity today in this earthly life, but that will live forever. And we become part of human civilization. And this idea, of course, all the great humanists, all the great scientists and philosophers and prophets had that idea. But it's also an idea of this difference between man and animals, the difference between a slavery system and a system of free societies. And this goes very, very long back into history with at least with the Greeks. Now we have the Promethean idea, because we have had this fight the whole time between empire and what we call a republican system. A republican system based on free individuals, independent societies. And we have an empire which is based on slavery, based on the rule of the strong, which does not respect human creativity, it just respects raw force. And of course, all intelligence they can garner, they use it to manipulate human beings. And that's the empire system. It has existed with human society a long, long time. And the Greeks, as far as we know, were in modern history are the ones who put their finger on it, with this idea of the difference between these Olympian gods who enslave human beings, like what we have in Prometheus Bound, this drama, where Aeschylus, he describes this fight between Prometheus and the Zeus, where Zeus represents the oligarchical slave system, where human beings are the slaves of the gods. But Prometheus presented something different, is that human beings can become creative, and with the spark of knowledge, the fire. And of course, Prometheus, he gave human beings the fire, and not only the fire, as symbolic, but even Aeschylus writes that he taught them how to build houses instead of living in caves, how to grow food, how to navigate in the sea using the stars, how to build tools, all these things which human beings can use their creativity to improve their society. These are part of this Promethean gift. And that's, Prometheus paid a high price for that, but it's worth it to make human beings free. And that has been the core of the Greek Renaissance at the time, and that's why a small number of city-states, independent free city-states, Greek city-states, could defeat this enormous Persian Empire in the battles of Salamis and Marathon and Salamis, 490 and 480, because the individuals were organized as free citizens, not as slave soldiers, and they were more effective, and they could come up with new ideas the whole time to defend their nation. So unfortunately, this the Greek society degenerated because it lost that Promethean idea. After the big victory over the Persian Empire, the Athenians, who were the core of the alliance, what's called the Delian alliance against all the Greek city-states and islands who were in alliance against the Persian Empire, they gradually became, developing into some sort of an empire, because they could dominate in the navy. Their navy dominated. They were the center of the financial power of all the Greek states. And then there was a shift in the mentality of the leaders of society, some sort of a degeneration. And then, of course, what you have developing is, like you can read it in the Socrates dialogues, is a degenerate consumer society, but it's not based on principles of truth. It's based on rhetoric, that politics is how you convince other people. If you're a good speaker and so on, you can win power, and that's really what politics is about. It's not about building society. Who can cheat most and is clever, that is a real politician. And therefore you had this democracy developing under Pericles. But at the same time, Athens was developing into an empire, and they started by, of course, using and enslaving their allies, their other allies in the Greek city-states, and actually enslaved them and put taxes on them. And Athens itself grew for a while, as most empires do, but then it clashed with the other strong allies in the Delian alliance, like the Spartans, because the Spartans were a strong city-state and they were warriors, and they had their own alliance. It's called the Peloponnesian alliance. These are city-states and islands which were in the southwestern part of Greece, while Athens built alliances in the northeast and in the Adriatic Sea. And that necessarily led to a civil war, what's called the Peloponnesian War, which started in 431 until 403. So almost 30 years war between the Greeks themselves. And the Persians were on the sides. They didn't disappear, and they were encouraging actually the fight. So the empire was still watching there, laughing at the Greeks, how they degenerated, and now they are destroying themselves. But the interesting thing is about the history of the Peloponnesian War is written by a Greek. He was a soldier in Athens, but Thucydides. He wrote this called History of the Peloponnesian War. I remember before the invasion of Iraq, there was big discussions in the United States, is that what the Bush administration is doing is transforming the United States, especially after 9/11, into an imperial instead of a free republic, that they want to turn the United States into an empire. And there was one professor, actually, I think he was German, and he said that American politicians should read this history of the Peloponnesian War. How these nations who want to become empires, what they do, they don't only destroy others, they destroy themselves, because they destroy their own soul and the purpose of their existence. And that's why, I read part of it, but what strikes me there is not the details of how the fight started. Actually, the Peloponnesian War also starts with a number of regime change attacks. Like there were small islands where the Athenians were encouraging one group to take over, make a military coup and take over and work with the Athenians, like what we have had in Iraq and Libya. But then when this regime change policy clashed with that, the Spartans became alarmed and they started mobilizing for war. Then the thing became a major war, like what we have now with the Russians and the Chinese. But it is interesting that before the war broke out, the Athenians sent one ambassador to Sparta to explain why Athens has the right to take over all the sea and all these colonies. And actually what he, I just pulled out this quote, which I want to mention, is the way of thinking. It's like, unlike Hans Christian Andersen, and also this Promethean idea, how empires think. And it's exactly the same disease, exactly the same problem. And this Athenian ambassador, he talked to the Spartans, and he says the following. This is part of it only. He says, "We are sure that you would have made yourselves just as galling to the allies, and would have been forced to choose between a strong government and danger to yourselves." He says, "We know that you would have done the same thing as we. It follows that it was not a very wonderful action or contrary to the common practice of mankind if we did accept an empire that was offered to us and refused to give it up under the pressure of three of the strongest motives: fear, honor, and interest. And it was not we who set the example, for it has always been law that the weaker should be subject to the stronger. Besides, we believe ourselves to be worthy of our position." So this is the oligarchical system. Here's the Athenians who fought against the empire. Now they say, we are the empire, because this is how human nature works. The stronger beats the weaker. You know, when I was reading this, I thought that this may be Susan Rice, the U.S. ambassador to the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, talking to the Russians. And say, "Why are you making such a loud noise about our conquerance? You would have done the same if you had power, because this is human nature. And this is what's wrong. This is not human nature. This is the oligarchical nature." And this is exactly the disease today. And it has been, of course, developing many years, but this has been the fight between this oligarchical system and the what we call the republican system. So, I mean, Greece was destroyed. Then there came the Roman Empire. But in the meantime, I mean, the Roman Empire also collapsed. So the Roman Empire almost took all civilization down with it, with disease and epidemics and everything. But fortunately, we had moments in history, we had people in history who fought against that imperial system. I mean, even under the Roman Empire itself, we had the Christianity emerging with the same idea of the sovereignty of the human individual, the immortality of the soul, and the necessity of building a society based on love and respect and creativity, and that human beings are superior to other creatures. We are not animals, but we are created in the image of God. We are Prometheans. And that also we had, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, we had also there was a possibility that both the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire collapsing at the 6th century. But we also had a new phenomena developing I'm talking now about the Mediterranean region, which is where history had its big movements, is that we had the emergence of Islam and the Islamic State, which is basically based on the same principles of Christianity and Judaism, and also this Promethean principle, the sovereignty of the individual, the sanctity of human life, and the necessity of building human society on higher moral and spiritual levels, but at the same time developing science and culture as part of this fostering of the human soul. And then you had the alliance between Charlemagne in Europe and Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad, these two, the Christian and the Muslim civilization, and that you had a massive Renaissance movement all over Asia, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and Western Europe. But then we had a setback with the emergence of Venice as a new empire, financial, military empire actually, and we had problems in the Islamic State itself because we had all these factional fights and also a certain type of degeneration of the higher ideas of what religion is about into more mysticism and so forth, and the focus on scientific cultural development took the backseat. And then we had all these different military groups and ethnic groups taking over and dividing the Islamic empire. But what we had is that the emergence of Venice as an empire, and Venice also represents exactly the same principles of the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire in it, and also this image of man, that human beings are beasts. If we are intelligent, we can better use our intelligence to manipulate and dominate other peoples. And therefore, Venice actually managed to keep Europe and Asia in a religious war, the Crusades, for more than 200-300 years, just to dominate trade and finances and so on. So every time you look at these empires and also the forces who are fighting the empire, you find exactly the same idea, the same image. If you read Shakespeare's Othello, that's exactly what you see. Yeah, Othello, it's called Othello, but the character in Shakespeare's Othello is Iago, who represents the Venetian way of thinking. A person who is smart, but he uses his intelligence to manipulate other people because he has an evil intention. And then he puts people against each other into fights which he creates. They are not real. And this is how Venice also created religious wars. They put one group against the other. I mean, there's a famous case when the Venetians, when these crusaders come from England and France to Venice, because Venice had the ships, the weapons, and the money, gold and silver money, to pay for the armies, the Doge of Venice told these crusaders, okay, we can finance you to go to Jerusalem, but do us a favor first. You know, there's a city on the other side of the Adriatic Sea. It's called Zadar in today's Croatia. We want you to go and destroy those bastards first. These are our competitors in the sea. And, you know, these were Christians. So the Crusaders said, no problem. If we get the weapons and ships and money, we go and destroy those guys. And they destroyed Zadar. Now today Zadar is back. I think it has a different name. It's a big tourist attraction too, but it's a big port. And then the next target was Byzantium, because they were also competing with Venice. So they sent the Crusaders, who were supposedly going to fight the Muslims, but they destroyed 2 Christian cities first. But they are masters of manipulating religion and religious senses. And this is what we have today, is that the British, who have dominated the last 300 years, because that's what Britain is, or the British Empire is about. It's a copy of Venice, an exact copy of Venice, all the methods. But what they have been masters of is to manipulate religion, religious groups. And they have been in Asia and the Middle East for 200-300 years now. They study the religions of these nations, the different ethnic groups, the different sectarian groups, not to enrich the British culture, but to learn how you can use the Sunnis against the Shia, you know? You can use the Salafis against the Alawites, and so on, the Sikhs against the Muslims. And they play all sides. because they have agents on all sides. It's like what we have in Syria today. I mean, Saudi Arabia, everybody was saying after 9/11, Saudi Arabia is the biggest financer of terrorism. You know, it's true, but it's not the Saudi people, it's the Prince Bandar and these, the gangsters and the Saud family. But now we are working with the Saudis to overthrow the Alawite, so-called Alawite regime in, why? Because the Saudis control all these so-called Wahhabi, Salafi networks who have been under development for many, many years. In Afghanistan against the Soviet, and then they were spread all over the Arab world. They were used in Chechnya. So they are the best ones who can manage these groups to overthrow the regimes we don't like for us. You know, you don't want to go out and do these things yourself. But now the crisis is so open, is that British intelligence and American intelligence, they are active there on the border with Syria, training people, checking the shipments of weapons and so on. As the excuse was that the CIA wanted to make sure that the weapons go to the right groups. You know, when the weapons come to Turkey, into Syria, the CIA have to check, okay, what is your name? You know, who are you? Okay, you take these weapons. So don't give them to the bad guys. Yeah, but it's a silly joke. But the idea was, also I have written about this, that the British have used this so-called Islamic card, not since the Afghan war. They used it actually back in the 19th century. For the British to have an empire, they will look for people they can use who have the same mindset, but who are in a weaker position. We had a video by the LaRouche back on the Rosa Luxemburg, but it actually discussed the crisis in Egypt, the debt crisis in Egypt, and how the British Empire manipulated Egypt to enslave all the Egyptian farmers to pay the debt of the Egyptian state. And that was after the building of the Suez Canal. The Khedive, or the king of Egypt, who was actually a Turkish Ottoman guy, Khedive Tawfiq, borrowed money from French and British banks, but could not pay back the debt. There were many wrong policies, but what the British and French did, they sent people to manage the economy of the Egyptian state. Or in 1872, 1873. And then it's like the IMF and World Bank, they were telling the king where to invest the money and where to get pay taxes, and you have to cut this, cut that, so they can collect money in Egypt to pay the debt to British and French banks. And the one person from Britain who was sent there was Lord Evelyn Baring, from the famous Baring family, the bankers, Baring Bank, which collapsed in '94. He was a banker, and he was sent as an advisor to the Egyptian king. But in Egypt, a nationalist movement developed to overthrow the king and get rid of the British and the French, who were advisors. They were not occupying the country. And in 1882, you had the revolt led by Egyptian officers who were ironically educated, and the Egyptian army was built by American officers in the West Point tradition. These were people who fought the Civil War against the British-backed southern states. And they actually established a very strong relationship with Egypt. I mean, Egypt became a focus during the Civil War in the United States because of the cotton production, which became a big export commodity for both the armies in America, but also the rest of the world, because a lot of the cotton production in the United States was being cut down by the Civil War in the 1860s, beginning of the 1860s. So there was a very special relationship. But when the cotton prices collapsed after the war, that's where Egypt got into economic problems and could not pay the debt. But interestingly, there were American officers who built the infrastructure and the structure of the Egyptian army, including actually one of the main principles of the modern Egyptian army, that the Egyptian army, that the Egyptian president is the commander-in-chief, that you also have a separation of the powers. But in any case, this Ahmed Urabi, who was an officer in the Egyptian army, he organized other officers, and they made a coup against the Khediri, the king, and then decided to establish a national government and get rid of this terrible debt to France and Britain. At that moment, the British said, oh, this is a red line, we're not going to allow you to do that. So they invaded Egypt militarily, the British army. So Evelyn Baring, or Lord Cromer, he was called later, he became the military governor of Egypt after being the banker. So this is the British Empire. You know, it's an empire of bankers. It's not of a nation. It's not the English people. It's these oligarchical banking interests. So overnight, this economic advisor became the governor of Egypt. And then he started running things directly. But the nationalist movement in Egypt was still strong. So what he came up with, and other British intelligence officers, is that they thought about this idea of these Islamists. There was one character who's actually one of the important theoreticians for later the Muslim Brotherhood, Sheikh Mohammed Abdu. Sheikh Mohammed Abdu was part of the revolt against the British, but then he was sent into exile into Cyprus and France. In France, he was recruited to a Freemasonic lodge. He and Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, another symbol of the Islamic movement. But then Lord Cromer, the governor in Egypt, he brought him back to Egypt and appointed him the Mufti, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, after being an enemy of the empire. And he started becoming his friend. Now, what was the idea? Is that in order to crush the nationalist movement, you can bring people who have a religious agenda, like the Sheikh Mohammed Abdu. And Sheikh Mohammed Abdu's so-called reform idea, which sounds good on the face of it, if you don't connect it to history, if you just read his book, it sounds very good. What he does say? He says, the problem in Egypt is not the British Empire, it's not the British occupation. The problem in Egypt is that the Egyptian people are not educated, and they are not following the true Islamic teachings. So what we have to do is that we have to reform society from the basis with the Islamic teachings, and we should have a dialogue with the British. That's not really a problem. This is our materialist things. But we have a dialogue with the British. They will leave one day, but we have to reform our society with Islamic teachings. And what happened in the meantime is that all the new laws which enslaved the Egyptian farmer, they were rubber stamped by the Mufti for the British. And he collaborated with them until 905 when he died. So the British, now they use this as a method. So when you have a new movement during World War I against the British Empire, they created another Islamic movement. And then you had the Muslim Brotherhood also becoming a counterpoint to the nationalists like Jamal Abdel Nasser, who made the revolution and kicked out the king and the British from the Suez Canal. The Muslim Brotherhood became always the counterpoint. Now, what is the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, it's not a religious thing. And we are not talking about religion. We are talking about the political movement which has been manipulated by empires. Because what is the Muslim Brotherhood ideology? Is no nation states. Why? Because all Muslims are brothers. All Muslims are one nation, from India, Indonesia to Morocco. So the idea is that you have to unite all these nations, but remove the borders, because we are all Muslims. So the issue becomes like, if you are a nationalist, like in the 40s and 50s, if you have a nationalist leader, they will call them communist, because they don't respect the Islamic religion. And this is the Saudis were good at. They were financing all these movements against, like in Iraq, you had a nationalist movement which took over in '58 against the Jamal Abdel Nasser, and so on and so forth. And even in Iran against the Shah, you had this religious movement. So it fits perfectly with the British. If you have people who have a mindset, we don't need nation states. We are all one big empire. But it's an empire which is run by the Saudis and some others, or Khomeini, whom we have Al-Yamama deals with. You know, we sell them weapons, we do intelligence work with them, and so on and so forth. But they are still under us. And that's what the danger today is, that from Morocco to India, including the Caucasus and Russia and Western China, is threatened by this so-called Islamist movement. The idea is not just simply to people want to become religious and practice their religion. The issue is a strategic geopolitical fight. And this has been the expertise of the British intelligence. And they use, as I said, the Saudis, who have a very strong grip over these new Islamic movements, or the Wahhabi, Salafi movements, and so on. But as we saw with the documentation of the 9/11 attacks, is that the same so-called allies of the United States, the Saudis, Prince Bandar, who was an ambassador to the United States, it's documented now that financed at least 2 of the hijackers of the 9/11 attack. And how they financed? Well, we are back to the empire. The British and the Saudis had this arms deal in 1985. I mean, the collaboration, the British and the French, goes back to the establishment of the Saudi kingdom. And during World War I, British officers were leading the Abdulaziz Al Saud army to expand his power over the whole Arab Peninsula. And they were arming him, they were financing him. Sir John Philby was the British officer who was controlling Abdulaziz Al Saud. And Abdulaziz Al Saud didn't have weapons, he didn't have money to pay his soldiers, but the British were there to help him establish the so-called Saudi kingdom. So the relationship is very old, but in 85 you had this Al-Yamama deal where the Saudis bought British jets and other weapons for a huge amount of money. The story is that this was not an agreement between 2 sovereign nations. This was an agreement between the East India Company and the Al Saud Company. They are not nations. And therefore the British were getting oil, 600,000 barrels of oil every day, in return for the weapons. So there is no money involved directly or contracts between nations. There is a formal contract of the Defense Ministry, but the payment goes through British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell. They pick the oil in Saudi Arabia for $3, but then they sell it for $50 in the market. So you have this enormous difference in the final price they get for the oil, and part of that went to commissions and bribes for Prince Bandar, for example, and other members of the royal family. But also you had a part of that money, it's about $600 billion so far, is that going to operations. As Prince Bandar himself says in his autobiography, that they were financing coups and militant groups in Africa. They had an attempt against Gaddafi earlier from that money. And the money for Prince Bandar was placed by the BAE, British Aerospace Systems, which is the arms, it's now the world's biggest arms company, placed in his account in Washington in the Riggs Bank. Now the Riggs Bank was closed later, but the money was transferred from Riggs Bank to 2 Saudi intelligence officers, I think in San Francisco, who were housing and financing the training of the 2 of the hijackers in 9/11. And all that is documented in the Congress investigation after 9/11, but there are 28 pages which are totally in black. These are classified, nobody can read them. The Bush administration classified them, and Obama is also refusing to declassify them so people can read what is there in the investigation, what did they find. And all experts say this is the part which is about Prince Bandar and the Saudi financing of these operations. So, but the interesting thing is that the Riggs Bank, when it was closed, Prince Bandar moved his money to the HSBC. This is one of the largest British banks in the world, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corporation, it was called, and they are as old as the Opium War against China. They were running the Opium War against the Chinese in the 1850s, and that's where their name come from. But it's an old British Empire institution. So the HSBC took over from Riggs Bank, Prince Bandar's account. But what HSBC is more known for now in the United States is that they were involved in the drug running and drug laundering drug money laundering from Mexico and South America into America, and operations to export weapons to the drug cartels in Mexico. You know, this is one of the biggest British banks, and now they are under investigation, both in the United States and in Britain, for money laundering and so on. But what happens usually is that these banks, under the British empire system, they can get a fine. You know, they can get a slap on the wrist, say, okay, you did something wrong, you pay $1 million. Like the Queen's own bank, Cotus Bank, they were found guilty of money laundering. But what they paid a fine, a few £1 million. Well, you are not guilty. It was the drug dealers who came in, and they found the door open, you know, and they laundered the money. But you should have watched out, you know. But the reality is, it's the British financial and banking system is built to facilitate the drug trade in the world. It's built to facilitate the arms running in the world. Not only to get money, they don't care about money. They know money is an instrument. They care about their strategic power in the world. And you cannot do that unless you destroy nation states, until you do clandestine operations, guerrilla groups, drug groups, criminal groups, and so on. And you have criminal groups who are called financial institutions. It's like the Library scandal. I think everybody now heard about it, that the British banks and in Wall Street, with the help of the current finance minister of the United States, they were rigging and manipulating the interest rates between the banks for many years now, and forcing people, including cities, towns, students, loan takers for household, to pay higher and higher interest rates. But they are all manipulated. So these are legal gangsters, you know. But they all work under. So what the British government's job is to protect these institutions who work outside the government. These are the empire institutions. The British government's job is to control the population of Britain and protect these other institutions, like Tony Blair did with the investigations of the BAE, these arms deals, and also all these lies. So that's how the empire works. But now that empire is collapsing because their financial system is collapsing, because their philosophy does not fit human society. It can live for a while. It can manipulate society for a while. It can take a lot of power for a while. But human nature and nature itself will reject that system, because it will lead to the destruction of society itself. Not only other societies, as we saw with the Athenians, but they started destroying their own society. And that's why inside Britain today, we have people who are at the very high in the financial and economic institutions who say, well, we think it's now time to implement the GlassSteagall bank separation law. And there's a big fight in Britain. There are people who realize that the system which we have had the last 40 years, this is collapsing. Okay, we sucked the blood of people, but that's not working anymore. It will hit back against us. What we can do, we can save the traditional British Empire. You know? LaRouche says, well, no problem. If we implement the GlassSteagall, we will go back to a system of nation states. And those British imperialists, they will not have a chance. If we consolidate a new financial and economic system with the GlassSteagall, if we have a national and international credit system with alliance between the United States, Russia, China, India, and these powerful nations, the British imperialists will not have a place. People in England and other places who want to serve the nation are welcome to work with us as independent nations, but not as an empire. And that's what the fight is about now. You know, somebody I think said that the war in Syria is the war of GlassSteagall, because there's a race. Because we have the financial system is collapsing rapidly, and they are trying to fill holes in the Titanic, you know, with money, like what the EU do. They print money and they give to banks, but then there's a bigger hole opening up next day. So they don't have much time. That system is collapsing. But some crazy people, including President Obama, have the ideas that Well, we can force the world to pay that debt by creating war. And we force everybody to do that, including the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and the Brazilians and the people in Argentina. They give up their economic development plans and pay for the debt now. And those people believe in what they are doing. But now there is, of course, a big fight. We have support in the United States Congress for the GlassSteagall. But are people courageous enough to say, there is no GlassSteagall actually if we have Obama as president? Because Obama will sabotage it. So now the LaRouche movement in the United States are mobilizing to make sure that in Congress, they go to the Congress, tens of young people, organizers, they go to Congress and talk to the congressmen. Say, before you go on recession, vacation, beginning of August, you have to decide to take out Obama. This is a hopeless case. So by the time people come back in September, before the Democratic Party convention, there is a real discussion in the Democratic Party about having an alternative to Obama. Some other candidate who can really represent the people of the United States and the principles upon which the United States was built, as a republic, not an empire. And the combination of GlassSteagall and new leadership in the United States, and with the input from LaRouche and the LaRouche movement, we can put the world back on a different trajectory, a different road. So all these small wars, all these small crises in Syria and Libya, they are all part of the big game. But the big game is dominated by this fight in different ideas. Hans Christian Andersen's idea about human beings as beautiful, creative, immortal creatures who do good in the world while they are alive. Or the empire, which says, we are strong, we decide. You are weak, you blame yourself. So we're going to use you. That's what the empire represents. But that system is too old now for the human race. I mean, we went from barbarism to feudalism to slavery and to, after the Peace of Westphalia and 100 years in Europe of religious war, to build modern sovereign nations. We went through World War I and World War II. We almost disappeared from the planet. I mean, we didn't take all this fight to go back to point one again, or zero, which we are threatened by now. But in order for people to understand and be able to mobilize people in society around them, why we should stop this war in Syria, why we should have GlassSteagall, and preserve the principle of nation state, they have to understand where does it come from. What was the price human race paid throughout history to establish a sovereign nation and a sovereign individual? That's the real fight. And if we don't understand that, we will be just talking pragmatism, and we will follow the news, and some politician comes and say, I have a solution, and you look at their idea of human being, what a human being is and what nature is, it's totally destroyed. So how can you trust those people? But we as citizens, we have to build that inside ourselves and be able to educate others, and including our politicians, that this is what human nature is, true human nature is. And that way we can start, studying the ideas, we can work on them. We have, the LaRouche movement have had at least 40 years of intensive studies and hard work to come with ideas how to solve this problem. Some of them are not new, like the GlassSteagall, it's Franklin Roosevelt's policy. Other things are new. It's like the idea of what physical economy is, which Lyndon LaRouche has developed. And also, unfortunately, now politicians don't have any idea about the economy, so we try to provide, like Helga Zepp-LaRouche in Germany led an international mobilization to come up with a solution to this whole Mediterranean crisis, Southern Europe, which we call the Mediterranean miracle. I think Paul, even it was translated into what kind of infrastructure and industrial and agricultural projects that we need to implement immediately now in France, in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy, Egypt, Tunis, all the nations around the Mediterranean as one economic unit in order to uplift the the society from the crisis, get people to work immediately. Like millions of people will be needed for these projects, and we can create enormous amounts of credit to finance these outside this EU British Empire system. So these ideas are available, and I mean, not everybody can produce them. If you don't have a different intention about why you are in politics, you won't be able to produce these ideas. And that's what is special about the LaRouche movement. So we have the ideas, we have the solutions. What we need is to mobilize people to get at the core of what that is. I mean, pragmatically, people will just take it. And a lot of young people love these ideas. They say, this is how my future will be secured, even without understanding the deep implications of it. But for the people who would go out and organize and mobilize, you have to get an idea of where does this come from. So that was my give.